The board on the wall showed 12 red markers. 12. One for each attempt. One for each time a trained, decorated, experienced shooter had lined up on the same target, under the same impossible conditions, and come back empty. 36 hours had passed since the first marker went up. The hostages were still in the basement. The target was still breathing. And the room, a converted warehouse packed with 28 of the most skilled people the unit had assembled, was running out of ideas. Master Sergeant Derek Calloway stood at the front of that room and said what everyone had been quietly thinking for the past 6 hours. He said it clearly, loudly, with the confidence of a man who had spent 17 years being the most capable shooter in every space he had ever occupied. He said, "This shot can't be made. Not by anyone. Not under these conditions. Not at this distance. Not with this atmospheric pressure." He said it to Captain Holt. He said it to the room. He said it to everyone. There was one person in the room who did not react to that statement. She was seated in the far corner, near the medical supply rack, where she had positioned herself at hour 1 and had not moved from since. She was listed on the unit manifest as Staff Sergeant Maya Reeves, 68W Field Medic. She had been in this room for every one of the 12 briefings. She had not been invited to any of them. She had not spoken in the last 4 hours. She had not spoken much in the 4 hours before that, either. If you have ever been in a room where the most dangerous person present was the one no one thought to ask, drop the name of your city below and tell us about it. Subscribe before you walk away, because what happens in the next 7 minutes inside that operations center is going to change how you see every quiet person you have ever dismissed. The board shows 12 failures. The story isn't about the 12. It's about the one they never counted. She had arrived 11 days before any of this, on a Tuesday morning, in a standard military transport vehicle with 2 duffel bags and a medical kit secured to the side. The unit's administrative sergeant processed her transfer paperwork at the desk by the main entrance without looking up from the form he was filling out. "Field Medic," he said, reading the classification header. "Recon attached." She confirmed it quietly. He handed her a printed schedule and pointed her toward the billeting area without making eye contact. She folded the schedule neatly, placed it in her left breast pocket, and walked to the billeting area without asking for directions. She had already studied the facility layout the evening before, from photographs included in the transfer packet. She studied every layout before she entered it. It was not a habit she had developed consciously. It was simply how she had always moved through space, with prior knowledge, with purpose, without advertising either. The unit was running at full operational tempo. 16 active-duty snipers were assigned to the mission, along with 3 intelligence officers, a logistics component, and a rotating shift of tactical coordinators who kept the operations center staffed around the clock. The mission brief had been running for 9 days before Reeves arrived. A high-value enemy commander sheltered inside a layered urban structure surrounded by a civilian buffer zone that made any ground approach an international incident in waiting. The extraction team was staged and ready 2 kilometers out. The only missing piece was a clean shot on a target that the structure's geometry made extraordinarily difficult to access from any angle that didn't put the round through 2 intervening materials first. The unit's lead sniper, Master Sergeant Derek Calloway, had expressed full confidence in the first briefing. His exact words, according to the transcript, were, "Give me the weather window, and I'll give you the shot." Reeves went to the medical bay on her first morning. She inventoried the supplies methodically checking expiration dates on medications, confirming quantities against the posted stock sheet, and verifying that the equipment calibration logs were current. During the inventory, she found a dosage reference card that another medic had been using for field pain management. The card listed the standard adult dose for a particular analgesic at 800 milligrams, which was the correct figure from the reference manual published 3 years ago. The unit's standing protocol, updated 8 months prior, had adjusted the field use threshold to 600 milligrams for personnel operating under sustained physiological and psychological stress, because that population metabolizes differently. She corrected the card. She left a note with the updated figure and the protocol reference, signed with her initials, clipped to the stock sheet. She did not bring it to anyone's attention, did not make a report, did not mention it at any briefing. Nobody thanked her, nobody noticed. That arrangement suited her. The first briefing she attended was the 3rd overall. She arrived 10 minutes early, took a seat along the back wall near the medical supply rack positioned against the east side of the room, and placed her casualty assessment notebook on her knee. Nobody assigned her that seat. Nobody told her where to sit for medical standby. She chose the position from which she could see the entire room without being in anyone's direct line of sight. The briefing officer was walking through the ballistic geometry of the target structure when Calloway interrupted to ask about the most recent atmospheric data. The briefing paused. The data was retrieved, and the briefing resumed. Nobody in the room turned to look at the woman in the corner. She was not introduced to the group. She was not acknowledged by name. She was the medic. Medics attended briefings as casualty and extraction planners, present for reference rather than for input. That was the assumption in the room, and no one questioned it. Corporal James Okafor ran the motor pool. He was 24 years old, had been with the unit for 2.5 years, and had the particular quality of a person who learned everything by watching rather than by asking questions. On the 4th night after Reeves arrived, he came into the operations center at 2:30 to drop off a vehicle fuel manifest, and found her alone at the planning table, seated in the low overhead light, with a topographic map spread open in front of her. She was tracing an elevation contour line with the tip of her index finger, slowly following it from the southern edge of the sector map toward the position of the target structure. She was not merely reading the map the way most people read maps, scanning, identifying, confirming what they already knew. She was following the terrain as if she were moving across it in real time, building it inside her mind, understanding it at the level of someone who would eventually have to act inside it. Okafor, who spent his own off hours studying topographic maps because he intended to apply for officer candidacy school, recognized the difference between reading a map and inhabiting one. She noticed Okafor when he set the fuel manifest down, and she said without hesitation that she was reviewing extraction routes, checking the terrain for viable casualty corridor options in the event of a ground engagement near the target building. It was a reasonable answer. Medics thought about extraction routes. The explanation was completely plausible, entirely accurate as far as it went, and not the whole picture of what she was doing at 0230 with a topo map and nothing else in front of her. Okafor understood this without being able to articulate why. He signed off on the manifest, told her good night, and walked back out to the motor pool. He did not mention the encounter to anyone. He filed it in the part of his memory where he kept things he had observed but not yet fully understood, and over the following days, as more failed attempts accumulated and the briefings grew longer and the room grew quieter, he returned to that image more than once, her finger on the contour line, following something the rest of the room hadn't found yet. The briefings continued, and the attempts accumulated. A sniper made an attempt on day 10 and came back with a miss he attributed to a wind shift in the final 100 meters. Another made an attempt on day 11 with adjusted data and came back with a different miss and a different explanation. The board gained its first 2 red markers. Calloway ran the post-attempt analysis sessions with the sustained confidence of a man who was certain that the problem was external and correctable. The wrong angle, the wrong atmospheric moment, an instrument reading that had not been precise enough. He used the word unfortunate 3 times in a single debrief. He positioned each miss as a data point, something that brought the solution closer by narrowing the field of error. The room accepted this framing because Calloway's record was real, his credentials were legitimate, and his confidence had the specific, grounded quality of a man who had been right in high-stakes situations many times before. It was easy to believe in him. It was what the room needed to do. In the 5th briefing, the intelligence officer running meteorological support mentioned almost in passing that atmospheric pressure at the target site had been registering at 989 millibars for the past 18 hours and was expected to remain in that range. He moved on to the next item without elaborating on what that pressure reading meant for ballistics. Reeves, in her corner, did not write anything down. She did not need to. She had been running the calculation continuously for the past several briefings, turning the numbers over with the patience of someone for whom the math was not theoretical. The 989 millibar environment created a low-pressure drift condition that pushed a long-range round approximately 14 inches wider than the standard ballistic tables accounted for. That figure was not guesswork. She had published it. She had included it in a range instruction manual and had taught it to 16 separate sniper qualification classes across 7 years at a facility in Georgia. The wall chart for low-pressure drift correction that she had drawn by hand was still hanging in that building. Calloway introduced himself to the unit in the first briefing, the one Reeves had not attended, by placing a challenge coin on the planning table next to the mission map. It was a coin from his most recent combat deployment, and he set it down without ceremony and said without smiling that the first person who could walk him through a cleaner solution geometry on the target position was welcome to it. Nobody challenged him. He had walked into the room with 17 years behind him and a file that supported every word, and no one in the space had a competing credential to bring to the table. The coin stayed where it was. In the 6th briefing, when the briefing officer noted in passing that a new medical transfer had been added to the standby roster, Calloway glanced briefly toward the back of the room, held his gaze on Reeves for approximately 1 second, and returned his attention to the map. He told the briefing officer that future sessions should be kept to essential personnel. He did not use her name because he did not know it. By the end of Reeves's first week, 4 more attempts had been made and failed. 6 markers on the board. The room was still functional, still organized, but quieter. The specific quiet of people who have maintained confidence, past the point where confidence is fully warranted and are beginning, slowly, to reassess. Calloway was louder than he had been. He ran longer analysis sessions, requested additional data from the intelligence officers, brought in supplementary wind modeling. He was applying more effort in precisely the way a man applies more effort when the problem in front of him is not the kind that yields to effort. Lieutenant Greg Ferris, a tactical coordinator who had been with the unit for 3 years and considered Calloway the most capable shooter he had worked alongside, backed every assessment with matching certainty. He said in a briefing that the conditions were simply unprecedented for this theater, that the atmospheric situation was extraordinary, and that the right man had the right approach. The room received this. Reeves received it from her corner. She made no record of it. On the 9th day of the mission, the 2nd day of the official 36-hour stall, Calloway attempted his 7th shot. He had spent 2 hours in pre-shot preparation, had reviewed all available environmental data, had coordinated with the intelligence team to confirm the target's position within the structure. The window was as favorable as anything they had seen. He came back in 40 minutes. The board gained its 7th marker. He did not run a debrief that morning. He sat at the planning table in silence and stayed there for a long time. Ferris sat next to him and also said nothing. Okafor was in the operations center at the time, returning a clipboard to the equipment station, and he watched Reeves from across the room. She was at the water station, refilling her bottle. She capped it. She walked back to her corner. She sat down. She did not look at the board. She did not look at Calloway. She did not look at anything in particular. She simply resumed the stillness that had become, over 11 days, the most consistent thing about her presence in that room. The attempt count climbed to 8, then 9, then 10. Each new failure arrived with its own attached explanation. A micro-adjustment the wind data hadn't predicted, a structural element of the target building that had deflected the round differently than the geometry suggested, a calibration variable that needed re-examination. Every explanation was technically defensible. None of them were invented, and none of them were complete. The complete explanation lived in the 14-inch low-pressure drift that the atmospheric environment was generating, combined with a secondary thermal deflection off the south wall of the target structure that none of the attempt postmortems had formally acknowledged. No one had run those two variables together because no one in the room had been taught to look for that specific combination. No one except the woman in the corner who had been listed as a medic for 11 days and who, in the next 8 hours, was going to stop being invisible. Attempt 10 was made at 600 on the 3rd day of the stall by a sniper named Watts who had 8 years of confirmed field experience and had never missed a verified engagement at under 200 meters. The target position was 1,847 meters from the established firing line, a distance that was within Watts's capability under standard conditions, and everyone in the room knew it. He had prepared for 4 hours before the attempt, adjusting for wind data, reviewing the pressure readings, running through the geometry of the approach. He waited for what the environmental instruments said was the right moment. He sent the round. He came back in 25 minutes and stood in front of the board and said 2 words: pressure drift. Calloway told him he had done the right thing by taking the shot under these atmospheric conditions. He told the room that the drift data from this attempt would help them refine the approach for the next one. He used the word data the way people use words when they want the room to believe a problem is being solved. Attempt 11 came 2 hours later, made by a sniper named Cardenas, who had cross-trained in long-range engagement for high-pressure and low-pressure atmospheric variants, and who represented the unit's most relevant specialized preparation for exactly these conditions. He spent 35 minutes in final preparation using the most current environmental data and the adjusted approach position identified after Watts's failure. He came back in 38 minutes and sat down without speaking. He looked at his ballistic data card for a long time and then looked at the wall. He said to no one in particular that the drift was running wider than his tables accounted for. Nobody in the room responded. In the corner, Reeves wrote a number on the back of a casualty assessment form. She wrote it, set the pen down, and did not write anything else. Okafor, who was in the room filing a vehicle fuel request at the admin desk, saw her hand move, but could not read the figure from where he stood. Captain Diana Holt had been running this mission for 9 days with the specific competence of a commander who understood the difference between patience and paralysis. She had authorized every attempt. She had listened to every debrief. She had asked good questions after each failure and had kept the room functional and forward-moving through consecutive setbacks that would have fractured a less disciplined operation. But she was also a person who tracked data with precision, and the data now showed 11 failed attempts by 12 shooters. Calloway alone had attempted 7 times, and an atmospheric condition that every post-attempt debrief was circling without fully naming. She pulled the meteorological log and read it herself. She did not share what she concluded with anyone in the room that afternoon. She asked the intelligence officer to confirm the target's current position within the structure. Then she called Calloway in for a private session and closed the door. The private session lasted 22 minutes. When Calloway came out, he was carrying the ballistic data card for the mission, and he had an expression on his face that Ferris had not seen on him before. Not uncertainty exactly. Not the look of a man who had been defeated, but the specific expression of someone who has been asked a question he does not prefer to answer out loud, and who has given a version of an answer that he knows is incomplete. Ferris asked him how the session had gone. Calloway said they were refining the approach and that the next attempt would benefit from everything they had gathered. He said it with the same vocal confidence he projected in every briefing, the same measured authority that the room trusted. But Ferris had been watching Calloway for 3 years, and he noticed the quarter-second gap between the question and the beginning of the answer that wasn't usually there, and he filed it in the category of things he would need to reassess at a later time. The 997 millibar reading came in at 1400 hours, posted on the environmental board by the meteorological officer without additional comment. It was the lowest pressure reading recorded at the target site since the mission had begun. The number meant something specific to anyone who understood how low-pressure environments affected long-range ballistics. It meant the drift correction tables the snipers were using had been calculated for a different atmospheric reality than the one they were currently inside. Reeves saw the number go up on the board. She did not look at it for more than a moment. She had already known the reading was coming. The environmental data trajectory had been pointing toward that figure for 6 hours, and she had been adjusting her internal calculations accordingly, layering the secondary thermal variable against the pressure model, arriving at a figure she had already committed to the casualty form in her pocket. She had written the only number that mattered. Everything else in the room was still catching up to it. Okafor left the operations center at 1500 on an errand to the vehicle bay, came back 20 minutes later with a parts requisition that needed a secondary signature from the duty officer. He found Reeves still in her corner, the table in front of her clear. The form with the number on it was no longer visible. He found himself standing near the door waiting for the duty officer, thinking about that number, and realizing that in the 20 minutes he had been gone, he had worked out in his head what it most likely was. He did not have her technical knowledge. He did not have her background. But he had studied enough ballistics as part of his officer candidacy school preparation to understand that the number she had written was almost certainly a drift correction value. And if that was true, then the people in this room had failed 11 times to hit the same target, and the correction was sitting in someone's breast pocket, and nobody had asked for it. Ferris ran the afternoon briefing because Calloway was in the field reviewing the newly identified approach position. Ferris was a capable briefing officer, but he was most comfortable with Calloway present to anchor the technical content. Without him, the session moved differently, less declarative, more questioning, with the intelligence officers taking more of the floor. One of them, a partner agency officer who had been observing the mission for 2 days, asked whether the drift variance had been fully modeled to account for secondary thermal conditions off the south face of the target structure. Ferris said he believed that data had been incorporated. The intelligence officer said he would like to see the specific modeling. Ferris said he would pull it after the briefing. The question remained in the room after the session moved on, hanging in the way unanswered questions do when the people present aren't sure who should answer them. Then Reeves spoke. She spoke from her corner, without raising her hand. She said the secondary thermal is running 4 knots, and the current attempt calculations are not reflecting it fully. She said it in a conversational tone, looking at the table in front of her rather than at anyone in the room, with the specific quiet of someone working through a problem out loud rather than addressing an audience. The intelligence officer who had asked the original question turned toward her immediately. Ferris turned. Okafor, near the door, turned as well. Nobody said anything for a moment. The brief silence that falls when a person who has been invisible says something that lands with unexpected precision. Then Ferris asked how she knew that. She explained that the environmental feed on the secondary monitor had been running the thermal overlay for 6 hours on an unattended loop, and that the thermal signature off the south face was consistent and measurable if anyone looked at that screen. She said it without inflection, without edge, delivering a fact the way she delivered every fact, as if the fact itself were sufficient and the manner beside the point. Ferris looked at the secondary monitor. The feed was running. The thermal overlay was active and had been active for hours. He had not looked at that screen once during the entire session. He had no memory of anyone else directing attention to it either. He studied it for a moment, then looked back at Reeves, then back at the monitor. He said something he would remember for a long time afterward. Not because it reflected well on him, but because it was an accurate representation of where he stood at that moment. He said he wasn't certain the thermal variable was relevant to the engagement geometry at this range, and that the lead shooter would make that determination when reviewing the full dataset before the next attempt. He moved the briefing to the next item. Reeves did not argue. She did not repeat herself. She turned back to the table in front of her and was still again. Okafor walked to the corridor and stood there for a moment, thinking about the specific texture of what he had just watched happen. Calloway returned from the field at 1700 and ran the evening briefing with renewed energy. He had identified what he believed was a slightly improved approach position 20 meters closer than the previous established line, and he presented this finding with the enthusiasm of a man who has been searching for a solution and believes he has found the right angle on it. He walked through the geometry carefully, showed the approach improvement, explained why the new position would reduce drift exposure on the engagement. It was solid analysis. The position he had found was genuinely better than the previous one. It was not good enough. It still did not account for the full 14-inch low-pressure variance, plus the 4-knot secondary thermal off the south wall. But it was better. And the room received it with real relief because the room had been needing something to believe in, and Calloway was offering belief with confidence. Holt watched the briefing without speaking until the end. At the conclusion, she asked one question. What is the total combined drift correction value being used for the next attempt? Calloway gave the number. She did not write it down. She did not react visibly to it. She simply nodded and closed the briefing. Later, alone in her office with the meteorological log and the post-attempt summaries spread in front of her, she did the arithmetic herself, the way she had learned to do it in an earlier assignment, before this command, when she had spent 14 months attached to a long-range engagement evaluation team in a different theater. She worked through the pressure variable, the primary wind drift, and the secondary thermal. The number Calloway had given her was short, not dramatically, but in the geometry of a 1,847-meter engagement with this specific atmospheric profile, short by that margin, would miss every time. She authorized Attempt 12 for the following morning. She wrote the authorization with the careful handwriting of someone who understands the weight of a final decision, because that was what it was. The last authorized attempt before the mission would be reframed, and the hostages' tactical picture changed permanently. The next morning arrived cold and steady, the pressure reading still at 987, the wind holding at 11 knots from the northwest, the 4-knot thermal off the south wall running exactly as it had been running for the past 26 hours. Reeves was already in the operations center when the night shift came in at 0300. She had positioned herself at the medical supply station, technically, but her casualty notebook was closed. She was looking at the environmental board. She had been there, as the duty log would later confirm, since before 0200. Nobody had asked her to come in early. Nobody had asked her to come in at all. Attempt 12 failed at 0547 hours. The shooter was Torres, the unit's backup long-range specialist with 4 years of confirmed service in that role, who had used Calloway's updated approach position and the updated drift correction table Calloway had prepared the night before. He had sent the round under the cleanest atmospheric window the team had seen in the entire 36-hour stall. He came back 11 minutes later and stood in front of the board without speaking. Holt stepped forward and put the 12th red marker on the board herself. The room did not react audibly. 12 markers, 36 hours, 3 hostages still in position. The mission was one decision away from being reframed entirely, and everyone in the room understood what that reframing would mean for the people in the basement. Nobody spoke for a full minute. That particular silence was unusual in a way that the previous post-attempt silences had not been. Every earlier failure had been filled by someone. Calloway with analysis, Ferris with backup, the intelligence officers with data requests, someone with the next question. This silence held. It settled into every corner of the room, and nobody moved to break it. Calloway was standing near the planning table with his arms crossed and his eyes on the board. His expression was controlled, his jaw set. He did not look at Holt yet. She did not look at him. The silence said what the room could not yet put language to, that the solution was not going to come from another attempt using the same position, the same correction tables, and the same calculations that had failed 11 times before. Then Holt did something that changed the shape of the next 7 minutes. She turned to the room, not to Calloway, not to the senior NCOs, not to the intelligence officers, but to the full room, every person standing in it, and she asked a question that had not been asked once in 36 hours. She asked if there was anyone who had not yet been formally consulted on the engagement geometry. She did not add context. She did not indicate who she expected to speak. She asked the question and waited. Ferris looked at Calloway. Calloway looked at the board. Two intelligence officers exchanged a glance. Okafor, at the equipment station near the east wall, looked at the corner where Reeves had been positioned since before Oro 200, the corner she had occupied every day since briefing number 3. Reeves stood up. She did not raise her hand. She did not wait to be acknowledged. She stood, walked to the planning table, and reached past Calloway's data spread to pick up the ballistic data card for the target engagement. She held it in both hands and read it in silence for approximately 15 seconds. She set it down. She turned to the topographic map on the wall and placed her finger on a position 40 meters east of every position any of the 12 snipers had used. She said, "This alcove in the partially collapsed structure at grid reference Delta 7 provides a compensated angle on the target that accounts for the full pressure variance at 987 millibars and eliminates the south wall thermal interference at the point of origin." She said it and sat back down. That was the whole sentence. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Calloway laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the specific laugh of a man who is certain he is hearing something incorrect, and who has enough standing in the room that his certainty is expected to settle the matter. He said the position she had identified had been ruled out in the second briefing because the Delta 7 structure showed evidence of ongoing settlement instability. He said a second-floor alcove in a partially collapsed building would give a shooter approximately 40 seconds of usable quiet before structural noise compromised the shot window. He said that was not enough time for this engagement. He said it clearly, confidently, with full technical accuracy as far as it went, because he was not wrong about the structural instability. He was wrong about the 40 seconds and about what the building had been doing for the past 18 hours. Reeves looked at Calloway for a moment, then at Holt. She said the structural settling pattern on the Delta 7 building had been running constant for 18 hours at a rate of 0.3 millimeters per hour, which produced an acoustic profile stable within acceptable variance for a 7-minute hold. Well outside the 40-second window Calloway had cited. She said it the way she said everything else, without heat, without performance, one fact and then the next. The room shifted, not visibly, not loudly. The way air pressure in a sealed space shifts when something changes the balance inside it. This was not the quiet of failure that had followed 12 red markers. This was the quiet of a room that had been certain about something and was now recalculating. Holt looked at the position Reeves had indicated on the map and held her attention there for a long time. She asked the intelligence officer if the structural assessment data for the Delta 7 building was in the current field package. He confirmed it was. She asked him to pull the structural summary for that specific address. He pulled it and placed it in front of her. She read the summary in approximately 45 seconds, moving through it with the practiced speed of someone who knows what she is looking for and exactly where to find it. She placed the document face down on the table. She looked at Reeves. She said, "Walk me through the full correction geometry." And Reeves stood back up, moved to the planning table, and began to speak. She spoke for 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Okafor was watching the clock above the environmental board, counting the time without deciding to count it. Simply aware in the particular way he was always aware of things the room was not attending to. She covered the pressure drift calculation at 987 millibars, 14 inches of variance over 1,147 meters, fully correctable from the Delta 7 angle. She covered the south wall thermal deflection, 4 knots of secondary interference, consistent and measurable on the feed that had been running on the secondary monitor unattended since the afternoon briefing. She explained how the angle change from Delta 7 eliminated the thermal interference at the point of entry and reduced the pressure correction to a single calculable variable. She spoke in the same tone she used for everything. When she finished, the room was silent in a way it had not been silent since the first red marker went up. Calloway said, "Who are you?" He said it without malice, without hostility, with the genuine disorientation of a man who has been the most qualified person in every room he has walked into for 17 years, and who is now standing in front of someone he registered as non-essential, and who has just corrected his work in front of everyone who matters to him. Ferris was watching Calloway's face rather than Reeves, and he saw what happened to it. Not a slow, graceful adjustment, but a sudden one. The specific collapse of certainty that has no warning and no gradual approach. The challenge coin that had been on the planning table for 11 days was 6 inches from Calloway's right hand. He did not move it. He did not look at it. He was still looking at Reeves when Holt gave the order. Holt said, "Get your gear, Staff Sergeant." She said it at normal conversational volume because the room had gone quiet enough that nothing louder was required. She was looking at Reeves when she said it. Calloway was still standing at the planning table, holding the ballistic data card he had picked up during Reeves's presentation, turning it over between his fingers without seeming to notice he was doing it. The challenge coin was 6 inches from his other hand. He did not look at it. Ferris was watching Calloway and saw him standing there, not arguing, not explaining, not performing. And that absence of performance was stranger than anything else in the room. Okafor was already shifting his weight toward the door. The instinctive movement of a person who can feel that something irreversible is in motion and wants to be present when it lands. Reeves was already outside before most of the room had processed what had just happened. She moved quickly, not urgently. The difference is held in the body, and hers showed no urgency, only purpose. Okafor followed her as far as the equipment bay door and stood in the frame, watching her pull a gear bag from a shelf that was not the medical storage shelf. It was a long case, black, secured with a combination lock she opened without looking at the dial, the way you open something you have opened 10,000 times and whose combination has become something your hands know independently of your attention. He had not seen that case in 11 days. He had not seen it arrive. He had not seen anyone move it or acknowledge its presence. It was simply there. The way things are simply there when no one thinks to question the presence of someone they have already decided is not important enough to track. Ferris found Okafor in the equipment bay doorway and stood next to him. They both watched Reeves go through her equipment in silence. Ferris said, "How long have you known?" Okafor said he hadn't known anything specific until today, but that he had been certain of something for approximately a week. Ferris asked, "Certain of what, exactly?" Okafor considered the question. He said he had been certain that she was the most careful person in the room, that she had been paying attention to everything, every briefing, every data point, every shift in the environmental readings, in a way that was not consistent with someone whose assigned job was medical standby. He said he had found her at Odu 30 on her 4th night with a topographic map open in front of her, and that the answer she had given him about extraction routes had been true as far as it went. and had also not been the complete picture of what she was doing. Ferris said nothing for a moment. Then he said he had dismissed her thermal observation during the afternoon briefing. He said it flatly, without softening it, the way a person says a true thing they do not feel comfortable with, but are not willing to dress differently to make it easier to deliver. He had told the room that the lead shooter would make the atmospheric determination and had moved the briefing to the next item. He said he had done it because that was the correct procedural response in the way the room was organized, and because backing Calloway's authority was what he had always done, and he had not paused to check whether the established procedure fit the specific moment he was standing inside. He said he wanted to know who she was. He did not say it with any tactical urgency at that point. He said it the way a person says something when they have been wrong for 11 days and they know it, and the only honest thing available to them in that moment is to admit they want the answer they should have asked for at the beginning. Okafor left the equipment bay and went to the administrative section of the operations center, where the unit's transfer documentation was organized in physical folders behind the unattended duty desk. He was not supposed to access those files without clearance from the duty officer, who was currently in the briefing room. He went anyway. He was thinking about a routing slip he had noticed 3 days earlier. A slip that had been misfiled with the medical documentation due to a processing error, carrying a unit designation in the origin field that he had seen before in a different context, and that he had not been able to place at the time. He found the slip. He read the unit designation. He knew what it was now. He had spent the past hour while Reeves was speaking to the room, placing it. He put the slip back in its folder, walked to the corridor, and went directly to Captain Holt's office without stopping. Holt read the routing slip in approximately 10 seconds. She held her eyes on it for another 30 after she had finished, which meant she was not rereading. She was sitting with what the paper said. She asked Okafor if he had shared the information with anyone. He said Ferris knew he had gone looking for something, but not what he had found. She told him to wait in the corridor, went back into her office, and closed the door. She was on the phone for 14 minutes. When she came out, she walked past Okafor without a word, went directly to the administrative section, and pulled Reeves's full transfer packet. She carried it back to her office. The door closed again. Okafor stood in the corridor and waited for 22 minutes, listening to the sounds of the building, until Holt came back out wearing the expression of someone who has confirmed a suspicion and found the reality of it significantly larger than the suspicion had been. The routing slip said what the routing slip said. The file said what the file said. But the full picture required context that neither document provided in full. Context the narration can fill in now, because this is the moment in the story where the room catches up to what Reeves has always known about herself. She had spent 7 years at the Advanced Sniper Training Course at Fort Benning, Georgia, not as a student, as an instructor. She had trained snipers. She had written the qualification standards for the 1,200-meter block of the AIA-STC curriculum. She had written the wall charts for low-pressure drift correction that still hung in that building. She had a confirmed qualification engagement on record at 1,640 meters, scored at 96.4 out of 100, which remained the highest score on that record in the course's history. She was not a field medic who happened to understand ballistics. She was one of the most qualified long-range engagement instructors the Army had produced in a decade, who happened to be carrying a field medic designation on her current transfer paperwork. The reason for the transfer was not in the file. The routing slip carried a redaction code in the origin field, the kind of code that covers a personnel action taken for reasons that someone above the paperwork level did not want preserved in a standard accessible record. Okafor knew what that code meant. Holt knew what it meant. What it meant was that the transfer had not been voluntary in the conventional sense. It had been arranged with Reeves' consent to resolve a situation that both parties had agreed was better resolved quietly. The situation was this. In a classified engagement 3 years prior, a commanding officer had submitted an after-action report attributing a confirmed long-range shot to his own assessment and direction. The shot had been Reeves's. She had the ballistic data. She had the positional record. She had not contested the report. She had signed the transfer instead. Ferris heard the version of the story that Okafor could share with him in the corridor. The routing slip, the designation, the redaction code, the shape of what had happened without the specific details that belonged to Holt and to the closed file. He stood with it for a long time. He thought about the afternoon briefing, the thermal observation she had offered in a voice just above conversational volume, the way he had redirected the room away from it and back toward the established chain of authority. He thought about 11 red markers on the board, a challenge coin that had been sitting untouched on the planning table for 11 days, and the specific quality of stillness she had maintained across every briefing she attended, never visibly frustrated, never pressing, never performing absence the way people sometimes perform absence when they want their presence to be noticed. She had been still. The room had read stillness as nothing. Stillness had been everything. In her corner, across every briefing she had attended, she had been running calculations that the most experienced shooters in the unit had not been running. She had been tracking the environmental data the way someone tracks data when they intend to eventually act on it, not as background noise, but as the primary input. She had said nothing because she had not been asked, and she was not a person who spoke into spaces that had not been opened for her. That was the code. Not silence as submission. Silence as the preservation of a resource for the moment when it would be needed. The way you conserve water, not because you are afraid of running out, but because you understand that the desert is long, and the moment for water is not always now. The moment for Reeves was not 11 attempts ago. It was not 10. It was now, with the mission reframe 4 hours away, and 3 people in a basement, and 12 red markers on the board, and a door she had just walked through to do the thing she had been ready to do since day 1. Calloway was still in the operations center. He had not gone to the field to observe the attempt. He had stayed inside at the planning table and had not spoken to anyone since Holt had given the order. Ferris came back in from the corridor and found him standing near the mission board, not doing anything specific with it, just standing near it the way people stand near familiar objects when the familiar thing they depended on has stopped working the way they needed it to. Ferris thought about what to say and could not find the right version of it, and after a moment he sat down at the coordination desk, opened his notebook to a blank page, and stared at the page. He thought about the afternoon briefing. He thought about the 4 minutes and 22 seconds she had spoken at the planning table, and about the specific look on Calloway's face during those 4 minutes. The face of a man who had spent 17 years being the authority in every room he entered, watching someone he had not counted demonstrate, without hostility and without drama, that the authority in this room had been miscounted. Outside, the clock on the operations center wall showed UO6111. The next authorized engagement window opened in 4 minutes. Reeves was already at the Delta 7 structure, or she should have been. Nobody inside the building knew for certain, because nobody had followed her out. And the communications channel she was operating on was the medical frequency, not the tactical net because no one had thought to reassign her channel before she left. The first transmission to come through from her position would not be a status update. It would not be a request for a hold or a call for additional data. It would be the sound of one round leaving one rifle, fired from a second-floor alcove in a partially collapsed building that 12 experienced shooters had been told was unusable by a woman who had been present for every conversation where that conclusion was reached and who had reached a different one. The operations center was quiet at 612. 28 people in a sealed warehouse 2 kilometers from the extraction zone, standing and sitting around equipment stations and planning tables with their eyes on a primary feed showing the exterior of the target structure. The board had 12 red markers on it. The planning table had Callaway's data spread, a ballistic data card, and a challenge coin that had not moved in 11 days. The clock above the environmental board read 0612. Reeves had been in position for 58 seconds. He had moved at some point while the room was focused on the primary feed to the east window of the operations center, which provided a direct sightline to the Delta 7 structure at just under 2 kilometers. He had set up his scope on the window ledge without asking for permission or announcing the action. No one had told him to. No one had told him not to. The room understood without discussing it that he was there because he expected to see a failure, and he wanted to be the one to see it first. The communications channel was on medical frequency because no one had thought to reassign it before she left. The tactical net was open and silent. The intelligence officer had confirmed the target's last known position inside the structure 2 minutes earlier, triangulated from passive thermal. Holt stood at the primary monitor. Okafor was at the equipment station 6 feet to her right. Ferris was standing, not seated. He had stopped being able to sit still somewhere in the previous 10 minutes and had not tried to hide it. At 0613, Callaway made a comment. He said the structure was moving. The micro-settlement vibration was visible in a high-magnification scope at this range, and he was not wrong to note it. He said the shot window was compromised by the vibration rate. He said this with the confidence of a man delivering a conclusion rather than an observation. Holt told him to note the time and be quiet. He noted the time on the coordination log. He was quiet for 40 seconds. Then he made another comment. He said the angle from the Delta 7 alcove would require the round to pass through a secondary structural element of the outer wall before reaching the target. He said it to the room, not to Holt specifically, in the tone of someone offering final confirmation of a thing that was already settled. Holt said his name once, 1 syllable, just his name. He stopped speaking. The room held. The primary feed showed the exterior of the target structure. Nothing moved on it. Nobody in the room moved either. The clock showed 06:14. 5 minutes elapsed. The clock showed 06:17. 4 minutes and 46 seconds of total silence on every channel since she had taken position and gone quiet. Okafor was watching the clock. Ferris was watching the primary feed without blinking. Holt was watching both simultaneously. Callaway was still at his scope, eye to the optic, watching the Delta 7 structure for the thing he was certain would not happen. Watching for it anyway, because he was the kind of person who needed to see a failure before he could accept that it had occurred. At 06:19 hours and 14 seconds, the shot, 7 minutes and 14 seconds from the time she took position to the moment she fired. Exactly the window she had described at the planning table. Exactly the time she had told the room the building would give her. No adjustment, no second calculation, no request for confirmation. Callaway was at his scope when it happened. He was looking through it at the moment of the trigger break. He saw what the scope showed him. He stayed at the optic for another 4 full seconds before he stood up. The operations center did not hear the round. The room was sealed, and the range was 147 meters, and physics carries consequence on its own schedule. What the room experienced first was the continuation of silence, the particular absence of further noise from the channel, the kind of silence that follows a thing you have been bracing for when the bracing is no longer necessary, when the waiting has been resolved and the resolution is larger than the room was prepared to receive. Then the radio crackled on the medical frequency. One transmission, 3 words spoken by someone in the forward observer position who had been watching through optics from a secondary angle. 3 words that carried the answer to 36 hours of failure and a challenge coin on a planning table and 4 minutes and 22 seconds at a map. 3 words. Then the transmission closed. Then Holt exhaled. Then the room understood what had happened. The room understood before anyone spoke. That is how it works when a thing has been suspended for too long and finally lands. The comprehension arrives ahead of the language for it, and for a moment the room simply exists inside the understanding, without the words to name it. 28 people. 12 red markers on a board that had no slot prepared for a 13th. The radio silent again on every frequency. The clock above the environmental board at 0619 and the thermal overlay still running on the secondary monitor, unattended, exactly as it had been running all day. Then one of the intelligence officers said, "Who is she?" He said it to the room, not to any single person, and with the genuine inquiry of someone who has just watched something that did not fit any category he had available. He had been in the operations center for 2 days, had attended 4 briefings, had been the one to ask the thermal data question that afternoon that Reeves had answered, and had watched her 4 minutes at the planning table. He knew her name was Reeves. He knew her designation said field medic. He did not know who she was, and for the first time in the entire mission, the question was in the room. Calloway answered first. He was standing near the east window, scope lowered, turned toward the room. He said her name. He got it wrong. He said sergeant and dropped the staff prefix, shortened her rank without meaning to, the reflex of a man who had never bothered to memorize the full designation of someone he had decided was not essential. He got the last name right. It was the first time in 11 days he had said her name in any form, and he got part of it wrong. Holt heard it. She looked at him, and she said it correctly. Holt said, "Staff Sergeant Maya Reeves." She said it formally, with full rank, in the deliberate tone a commanding officer uses when they want a name to land with the weight it carries. She said it to the intelligence officer who had asked the question, but she said it to the room. She said it the way you say something that should have been said 11 days ago, and that you are now saying precisely, formally, with no room for the truncation or the erasure that had been in operation for longer than it should have been. She did not add context. The name, said fully and correctly in that room, was its own context. Calloway looked at his rifle. He was still holding it at his side. He had unslung it from the window position and had not yet set it down, his hands occupied without his attention, the way hands stay occupied when the mind is somewhere the body has not caught up to. He set it on the windowsill. He looked at the room. His audience, Ferris, the intelligence officers, the snipers who had each failed once, the support staff who had been in every briefing and every debrief, was not looking at him. They were looking at the door, The door Reeves had walked out of 7 minutes ago and had not yet come back through. Ferris said her name, not Calloway's version, the full version, with the rank prefix, the way Holt had said it. He said it quietly, not to anyone in particular, not even entirely certain he had said it aloud until Okafor turned toward him. Okafor looked at him for a moment. Ferris looked back. There was no name for what passed between them, but both of them would have recognized it if asked to describe it later. The specific feeling of watching a room change what it knows, not with a dramatic gesture, not with a statement of correction, but with the weight of a name said right after it had been said wrong for too long. Calloway sat down. He chose the chair near the east window, not the planning table with the challenge coin. He set the scope on the ledge and was quiet, not performing quiet, not the deliberate professional silence he deployed in briefings as a tool, but genuinely quiet, without audience, without a calculation behind the stillness. For the first time in 36 hours, he was not performing for anyone. The audience he had maintained for 17 years was looking at a door. He had been wrong, not because he lacked skill. The skill was real. He had been wrong because he had spent the entire mission performing when the mission required calculation, and the person doing the calculation had been sitting in the corner. The door opened. Reeves came in, still carrying the rifle, coming back directly the way you come back when the task is done and there is no reason to delay the return. She set the rifle on the equipment table, signed the checkout log in the field medic column because that was the column she had used when she signed it out, and turned toward the main space. The entire room was facing her. Not a rehearsed reception. 28 people who had each been looking at the door and were now simply continuing that look as the door answered them. Holt was already moving from the monitoring station toward the center of the room. Holt reached her first and said 2 words before anyone else could speak. Reeves heard them, held Holt's eye for a moment, and nodded once with the same stillness she had maintained across 11 days and 12 briefings and 36 hours of being invisible by design. Then Holt turned back to the room and said she had an announcement to make, and that she needed everyone currently in the support bays and vehicle area to come in and hear it. Something in her tone made it clear this was not a routine matter. 41 people stood in the operations center at 6:33 hours on a Tuesday morning in a converted warehouse 2 kilometers from an active extraction zone. The support staff and the motor pool crew, the snipers who had failed on 12 attempts and the ones who had not yet attempted, the intelligence officers from 2 separate agencies, the tactical coordinators and the administrative personnel, all of them gathered in a room that held stale coffee and recycled air and 12 red markers on the mission board and a challenge coin on the planning table and a woman standing near the equipment rack who had checked out a rifle under the field. Medic column at 06:05 and returned it at 06:27 with 1 round expended from a position she had identified in 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Holt called the room to attention and did it the way she did everything, without theater, with precision, the authority arriving from the quality of the delivery rather than the volume. She said, "Effective as of 0619 hours this morning, the primary target of this mission has been neutralized. The extraction team is currently active, and the 3 hostages are in transit to the secondary collection point as of this transmission." She delivered the operational summary first, the way a good commanding officer delivers good news, the outcome, then the context, because the people in the room needed to hear the outcome before they could absorb the context. Then she paused for a moment that was longer than a procedural pause needed to be. Then she said, "The engagement was made by Staff Sergeant Maya Reeves, 68W, assigned to this unit 11 days ago as a medical transfer, listed on the manifest as field medic. The room received this in the specific silence that follows something it already knew on some level, but had not yet heard made official and permanent." Holt continued without waiting for the silence to resolve. She said that Staff Sergeant Reeves's designation on her transfer paperwork listed her as a field medic, which was technically accurate and was also, Holt said with deliberate precision, substantially incomplete as a description of her qualifications. She said that Staff Sergeant Reeves had spent 7 years as a primary instructor at the Advanced Sniper Training Course at Fort Benning, Georgia. She said that Reeves held a confirmed engagement record on the ASTC qualification range at 1,640 meters, scored 96.4 out of 100, which remained the highest score ever recorded on that range. Calloway was in the front row. He had not left the room when Holt called the unit together. He had remained in the east window chair and was simply already present when 41 people gathered around him, which meant he ended up in the front row without having positioned himself there, and that accident of geometry had a quality of its own. He did not speak during the announcement. He did not interrupt or offer context. He listened with the stillness of a man who has decided that staying present through the documentation of what happened is the only honest remaining option. He was looking at Reeves while Holt spoke. Reeves was looking at Holt. The challenge coin on the planning table was 3 feet behind Calloway, and he did not look at it once. Ferris stood straight during the entire announcement, with the posture of someone who is paying full attention as a form of apology. Not a performative apology. Not one that called attention to itself, but the kind that lives in the body and shows up as the decision to be completely present for the thing happening in front of you, rather than managing your own position inside it. He would tell this story many times afterward, to people who had not been in the room, in conversations where he was asked about the mission or about the stall or about what finally broke it. He would always begin it the same way, always with the same sentence. He would say, "There was a medic in the room for 11 days, and then he would tell the rest, starting from the afternoon briefing where she named the thermal data and the room redirected away from it, and working forward from there. Okafor stood near the door where he had been standing for most of 11 days. He was watching the room, which is what he always did. He watched Calloway receive the announcement without speaking, watched Ferris standing straight, watched the snipers who had attempted and failed each, carrying the failure slightly differently now. Not with shame, he thought, but with the particular recalibration of people who have learned something true about a thing they believed they understood. He watched Reeves accept the room's attention with the same stillness she had maintained in her corner for 11 days, and he thought about the topo map at Uro 230 and the extraction route answer and the number she had written on the casualty form, and how long the room had had access to what she knew and had chosen not to look. The challenge coin was still on the planning table when the room cleared. Nobody picked it up. The board still had 12 red markers on it. Nobody removed them. Those things would get dealt with in the administrative follow-up, the way administrative follow-up deals with the material record of events that have already resolved themselves. The record that mattered was simpler and did not require a board. 3 hostages recovered. 1 round expended. 7 minutes and 14 seconds from the moment she took position to the moment she fired. By a woman who had been in that room every single day from the beginning, who had attended every briefing where the shot was discussed, and who had not been asked a single question until the 12th failure made the question unavoidable. The narration can offer a moral here, and it will, because this story has earned one. The room was never missing a shooter. It had a shooter from day one. What it was missing was the willingness to see one, the willingness to look at a person who did not perform competence and ask whether the absence of performance was evidence of incompetence or evidence of something else entirely. Real competence does not perform. It calculates. It waits. It keeps its corrections in a breast pocket next to a schedule it never needed to consult. And when the room finally goes quiet enough, when the 12th failure has been logged and the mission is 4 hours from being reframed and someone at the front of the room asks if there is anyone who has not yet been consulted, it stands up. It crosses the room. It puts one finger on the map. And in 7 minutes and 14 seconds, it ends what 12 performances could not.